On a cold Friday afternoon in December of 1995, John and Shelly Markley's 5 children returned home from school to find the house in disarray and their parents missing. There were no notes or calls, nothing to suggest where they might have gone or when they would return. There were, however, several disturbing signs which indicated something might be wrong. Safes and locked cabinets were found open and emptied, the coffee pot was still on and had nearly brewed dry, and the tarps, which always covered John's prized Corvette, were missing. The couple's absence was noted as particularly disturbing because this was not just any old Friday. It was both the 8th birthday of their youngest child, and that evening was a wake for John's beloved twin sister, who'd passed away days earlier. If there was anything that could be said about John and Shelly, it was that they would have never missed either event for anything in the world. Family meant everything to them, so where had they gone? That's a question which nearly 30 years later remains unanswered. Local investigators would find themselves embroiled in a case of organized chaos, from a crime scene stripped of evidence by family members with good intentions to a bizarre extortion plot involving an old friend turned enemy. Were John and Shelly the victims of a random crime? Had they been targeted by a former friend? Or was their disappearance about something entirely different, something no one has yet managed to uncover? This is Trace Evidence, episode 249, The Disappearance of John and Shelly Markley. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the strange and mysterious disappearance of John and Shelly Markley, who left behind 5 children, a completely paid-off house, and a series of unanswered questions which continue to haunt their loved ones as well as investigators to this day. This is the disappearance of John and Shelly Markley. Friday, December 15th, 1995, was a cold and gloomy-looking day in the northwestern Ohio township of Bloomfield, approximately 40 miles northwest of Youngstown. Though the two areas were divided by just over 30 miles, they stood in stark contrast to one another. While Youngstown was the larger area by far, it was also home to more than 90,000 residents, while all of Bloomfield Township held less than 2,000. Youngstown was the city to folks in Trumbull County, a busy metropolitan area, while Bloomfield was vastly more rural, quiet, and underdeveloped. Gray skies hung heavy overhead with the threat of rain, or perhaps snow, looming along the edge of every sharp breeze, and locals clung tightly to their jackets as they went about their daily business. Christmas lights were strung along power poles and colorful decorations adorned the slightly fogged glass of store and home windows, with Christmas just 10 days away. You could see the excitement on the faces of school children as they made their way to class, pink cheeks amidst a cloud of hot breath in the chilled air. For many, it was a time of delight when families come together to share in their joy, love, and celebration. For at least one family, though, their holiday excitement was tempered by a tragic loss, which brought them together in a time of grief and mourning. However, that would only be the beginning for them, as another tragedy would strike, leaving them without answers and, in many ways, without the hope of a reprieve. It began quietly that morning at a small red brick building just north of the intersection of Ohio 87 and 45 in the heart of North Bloomfield. Today, a hardware store, the building was at the time a local bank, which served many residents in the rural community. Despite renovations and a change of business, you can still see the old drive-up window located along the southern wall of the structure. On this particular Friday morning, it was through that very window that John and Shelly Markley were seen alive for the last time. It was approximately 10:30 in the morning when the Markleys' red over silver Chevy pickup truck pulled around the brick building and stopped at the teller window. The woman working the window that morning greeted the occupants of the vehicle, which she would later note as counting 3. There was John Markley, sitting in the driver's seat, and his wife Shelly, sitting between her husband and another man the teller did not recognize by sight. According to the bank employee, she did not notice anything particularly out of the ordinary at that time, and after greeting the couple, she was informed that they would be making a withdrawal. The teller watched as Shelly produced a $1,000 check, wrote it out to cash, and signed it right there, leaning on the truck's dashboard. Handing the check to the teller, she quickly processed it and counted out $1,000, which she then tucked into a small yellow envelope along with a receipt of the transaction. Handing it over, the teller asked if there was anything else she could do for the couple, but Shelly simply shook her head. The teller wished them a good Friday and watched as the truck slowly drove back onto Ohio 45. A few hours later, the Markleys' 5 children would arrive home from school to find the family's rural, isolated home in disarray, and their parents gone with no note, no messages, nothing to explain where they had went or when they would return. Family members reported them missing a little more than 12 hours after they had last been seen, when the two failed to arrive at a wake for John's twin sister, who had passed just days earlier. It had been a devastating loss for John, and while some believed he'd taken off with his wife to process his grief, almost no one in the family believed that to be a viable possibility. John had been close with his sister, and he wouldn't have missed her wake for anything. What would soon become a key to determining just what had happened to the Markleys revolved around that second man seen in the truck that morning. Who exactly was he, and what role had he played in their disappearance? John Markley Jr. was born on Wednesday, July 8, 1959, to parents John and Ruth in Valdosta, Lowndes County, Georgia. John was one of 10 children born to the Markleys alongside his twin sister, Bonnie. According to available records, John's family moved around a bit during his childhood, but by the time he turned 14 in 1973, much of the family was comfortably settled in Ohio, predominantly located within Trumbull County. John has been described by friends and family as a kind-hearted, fun-loving man who enjoyed a good laugh. Many have noted that John had a deep affection for his siblings and parents, which instilled a tendency in him to always put family first. Loyalty and devotion were less a choice for John, but more a way of life, something that he learned from a young age and something that continued to grow throughout his lifetime. Shelly Renee Applequist was born on Saturday, November 16, 1963, to parents Orrin and Carol in the city of Warren, the seat of Trumbull County. One of 3 daughters born to the Applequists, she would go on to be one of 5 children alongside the addition of 2 brothers. Smart, sweet, and kind, Shelly has been described as a warm, though somewhat shy young woman with a big heart and a lot of love to offer. She was extremely attentive and caring, always offering a shoulder to cry on or a tight hug when someone needed it. For the most part, people speak extremely fondly of Shelly and describe her as one of a kind in many ways. Deeply connected to family and friends, she was loyal and devoted, 2 key attributes she and John would connect over later in life. Little has been shared about the specific details surrounding Shelly and John's meeting and eventual relationship. Friends and family, however, have noted that when the two met, there was an undeniable spark felt on both ends, and they quickly fell deeply in love. Trumbull County records show that on Friday, November 30th, 1979, John and Shelly were officially married in a ceremony overseen by Reverend Albert Broadwater of Bristolville. According to the marriage document, John was at that time listed as living in Cortland, a city just 10 miles northeast from Warren, where Shelly had lived her entire life. At the time of the wedding, John was 20 years old and Shelly was 16, and as a result, both of her parents signed the document giving their consent. One section of the certificate offers a line detailing each individual's occupation, and while Shelly's is blank, John's notes that at the time, he was working as a driller on an oil rig. Following their nuptials, John and Shelly wasted little time in beginning the formation of their family. Over the course of the next 16 years, the couple would have 5 children, 4 girls, Ruthie, Stacy, Bonnie, and Crystal, and 1 son, Johnny. John and Shelly were deeply loving and devoted parents who wanted the best for their children. John went on to become an independent truck driver while Shelly remained with the children and was described by friends and family as a homemaker. Their children, later in life, would describe their mother as deeply loving and caring, noting that she managed to wrangle and corral all 5 of the kids each week to go grocery shopping together. Their father, they said, was a very loving and protective man who was a bit on the strict side, telling the 4 girls that they weren't allowed to date until they were 16. John's sensibilities in that regard may have had more to do with the fact that Shelly was 16 when they married, and he wanted his children to choose a different path. Unfortunately, the Markleys would lose their first home in a terrible fire which ignited on Sunday, July 4th, 1993. While a terrible incident, the Markleys rebounded quickly and began looking for a new home, a forever home. The couple ultimately purchased and settled into a 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom, 1,600-square-foot home seated on a little more than an acre of property located along Greenville Road in West Farmington, a rural village in the northwest of Trumbull County. West Farmington is very rural, with a lot of woods and farmland surrounding it. When the Markleys moved into the house in 1993, the total population of West Farmington was listed as only 542. 27 years later, in 2020, the population count is exactly the same. Now, in order to avoid confusion, I should note, some sources list their home in West Farmington, while others state the location as Bristolville, 9 miles to the west. Looking on a map, the family home was nearly equidistant, approximately 1 mile closer to Bristolville, an unincorporated community in central Bristol Township. Greenville Road, also known as Ohio 88, runs approximately 50 miles, primarily east to west, beginning in Portage County and terminating in the east just past Vernon at the Pennsylvania state line. The family home is rather isolated, with a handful of neighbors located miles down the road. For John and Shelly, it was exactly what they'd been looking for, the perfect place to raise their growing family. Wisely, at the time of the purchase, the Markleys used what funds they had to completely pay off the home, leaving them only with annual taxes to cover. John was doing well and ultimately formed a long-distance trucking company, Markley Trucking, and would go on to own at least 2 semis. However, perhaps the pride and joy of his vehicles was a beautifully maintained 1978 deep apple red Corvette that was always kept in the garage beneath 2 tarps to double protect it from any potential damage. While things were going well for the Markleys, the year of 1994, just 1 year before their disappearance, would prove a challenging one. By sheer will of seemingly bad luck, 1 year after their home burned down, on Monday, July 4th, 1994, John's father, John Markley Sr., passed away at the age of 80. It was a tough loss for John, who looked up to his father and, of course, was very close to his family. Before the wound of that death could even begin to heal, 1 month later in August, a nephew of the couple also passed away following a struggle with depression. It was a harsh summer, with loss and pain, but unfortunately, this was just the beginning for John and Shelly, as there was another terrible loss to come, and that would happen just days before the couple seemingly vanished from the face of the earth. By December of 1995, John, then 36 years old, and Shelly, 32 respectively, were living together happily, raising their 5 children. The 4 girls were all within a year or two of one another, with their ages listed as 12, 13, 14, and 15, while Johnny was 7 and looking forward to turning 8 in the middle of the month. Although John still had the trucking company, money was a little tight. He had re-aggravated an old back injury, making it difficult, if not impossible, for him to drive long distances, and so he was staying at home and collecting disability. Unfortunately, things were about to take another tragic turn when on Wednesday, December 13th, John's twin sister Bonnie passed away after losing a 3-year battle with breast cancer. John was absolutely devastated by his twin sister's death. According to the family, Bonnie was initially diagnosed with breast cancer 3 years earlier in 1992. She took every step she could to try and fight the disease, but while some efforts may have delayed or slowed the spread, nothing seemed capable of stopping it. Desperate to get her effective treatments, the family managed to raise $15,000 to send her to Tijuana, Mexico for experimental treatments which showed promise, but ultimately could not help. Bonnie spent 6 weeks in Mexico during the summer of '95, and John ended up selling his above-ground pool to contribute additional money to continue funding her stay south of the border. When Bonnie returned to her home in Ashtabula County, she scheduled an appointment with her doctor to check on her progress. Sadly, the doctor informed Bonnie that her condition was terminal and they could do little more than make her comfortable. John was there the night his sister passed away, and it was clear to everyone that he had taken it harder than the rest of his siblings. Bonnie and he were close, and he had convinced himself that somehow, no matter what the doctor said, she was going to pull through. John's sister, Linda Mason, noted the pain and grief her brother experienced that night, telling the Tribune Chronicle, quote, "He said he never prayed so hard all his life to God to heal her. He was angry. I told him Bonnie was in a lot of pain and anguish and that God took her so she wouldn't have the pain." According to the children, they saw their father sobbing in the aftermath, repeating over and over to himself, "Part of me is gone. Part of me is gone." Arrangements were made at the Trask Funeral Home, located in Middlefield, 12 miles northwest from the Markley family home. Though John had broken down following the death of his sister, his children and siblings noted that by the next day, he had managed to pull himself together. He was still heartbroken, no doubt. Anyone could see that written all over his face. But he pushed through and was determined to be there not just for Bonnie, but for the rest of the family as they navigated this tragic loss. A viewing was scheduled for the evening of Friday, December 15th, with the funeral to follow the next day, Saturday the 16th. Neither John nor Shelly would make it to either the visitation or the funeral. In fact, the last time they would be seen alive is at the bank on the morning of the 15th, leaving behind 5 children, a chaotic scene at the home, and a long list of questions which remain unanswered to this day. Friday, December 15th, was a cold and wet day in Trumbull County. At 7:42 a.m., sunrise gave pale illumination, partly obscured behind the dull gray curtain of an overcast sky. Temperatures lingered in the mid-30s with high humidity, making for a cold and uncomfortably damp morning. The day would show little improvement with periodic showers, growing winds sweeping in from the south, and temperatures barely breaking into the 40s. At the Markley home, it was set to be a difficult day, featuring the stark contradiction between Bonnie's funeral and a celebration of Johnny's 8th birthday. What few details we have about the activities in and around the home on Greenville Road that morning come from the children, with young Johnny being the last to see his parents after his older sisters left for school that morning. Johnny would later tell investigators that after getting up and getting ready for school, he went into the kitchen where Shelly made him a bowl of cereal. After breakfast, the two walked out of the house together and Shelly accompanied Johnny along Greenville Road to his bus stop, waiting with him until approximately 8:30 a.m. when he made his way to school. This was the last time any member of the Markley family would see either John or Shelly, but no one would be aware anything might possibly be wrong until hours later, when Johnny's sisters arrived home from school to find an empty house with several odd and out-of-place details. Firstly, upon arriving home, the children found that all 4 doors leading into the house were closed but not locked, something very out of character for the Markleys who, living out in a rural area, were quite security conscious. Several of the children noted that despite the unlocked house, the family's Chevy pickup truck was not parked in the driveway and there were no signs of John or Shelly. Inside, the story took an even stranger turn. In the kitchen, there were several indications that things were not right, with the children noting the coffee pot was powered on and still heating to the point that it had nearly boiled dry, suggesting someone had started the coffee maker but was not there to turn it off when it finished. On the counter sat a fake leather cigarette case holding a pack of Marlboros with a lighter beside it. Shelly was a big-time smoker and never left her cigarettes behind, even if she were just going on a short errand. In addition to this, John's watch was spotted on a shelf above the stove where he would normally leave it at the end of the day. But John never went anywhere without the watch, and after waking in the morning, one of his first steps for the day always involved securing that watch to his wrist. One relative later told police that he'd actually witnessed John in previous days coming into the kitchen still in his pajamas and putting that watch on before he even had his first cup of coffee. Stepping into the attached garage, the kids immediately noticed that John's prized 1978 Apple Red Corvette was sitting in its usual spot, but the two tarps which always covered it were gone. According to the family and friends, John absolutely never left the Corvette uncovered, as he was extremely paranoid of potential scratches from one of the children's bikes or toys. Back inside the main house, the kids proceeded upstairs to their parents' bedroom, where several things stood out to them. Firstly, the gun cabinet was unlocked and the door was hanging open, and this was a major red flag. John had collected guns over the years and was very careful, considering the children, so he always made sure they were locked up. Deeper inside the bedroom, the kids found two suits of John's laid out on the queen-size bed beside a couple of Shelly's more formal outfits, seemingly the clothing the couple planned to wear to the wake that night. The bed itself was unkempt, and it was later reported that none of the beds in the house were made, something that Shelly was always meticulous about doing. There was a walk-in closet just off the master bedroom, which housed a small safe. The safe was found open, and a lockbox, which was normally kept inside, was sitting on the bathroom counter, also opened. There were legal documents, paperwork, and even birth certificates strewn about, and it appeared as though someone had gone through the box, maybe even the whole house, in search of something in particular, but the kids didn't have any idea what that something might be. In fact, at that point, the kids weren't even sure something untoward had happened, and instead, knowing how devastated John had been by Bonnie's death, they initially assumed the couple had gone to run errands that had taken longer than expected, or maybe they'd gone for a drive to clear their heads and take a little time away from their grief and pain. However, as time continued passing and the calling hours for the wake drew near, the kids decided to contact their aunt and uncle, Judy and Tom Yeager, who lived just a few miles away. Unsure of whether or not anything was wrong, Judy instructed Ruthie to make some food for her brother and sisters. She said she and Tom would come by shortly, and in the interim, Ruthie prepared some peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for her siblings. Judy and Tom arrived shortly thereafter, around 4 p.m., and decided to wait at the house with the kids for John and Shelly. They never showed, and at 5:30 p.m., it was decided to leave for the funeral home. So Judy and Tom loaded the children into two separate cars and made the short drive to Middlefield. Judy would later state that she had desperately hoped to find John and Shelly already there, waiting for their arrival, but they were nowhere to be found, and no one had heard from either one of them. Calling hours lasted a little over 3 hours and concluded at approximately 9 p.m. Judy gathered the children together and took them back to the home on Greenville Road. The house was still empty, and there was no sign that John or Shelly had returned. Finally, just after midnight on Saturday, December 16th, Judy and Tom decided to contact the Trumbull County Sheriff's Office to report the couple and their red over silver Chevy pickup truck missing. Sheriff's deputies noted that they would need to keep an eye out for the couple and their vehicle and planned to come and look through the house after the family had laid Bonnie to rest. The funeral began at 2 p.m., and up until the moment of the service, Judy and the kids were still expecting to see John and Shelly come walking in, ruffled and full of apologies and excuses, but they never showed. There was a big turnout for the funeral, They had a large family, and Bonnie had a lot of people in her life who cared deeply and had mourned her loss. The only members of the family who did not attend were John and Shelly. Several members of the family noticed their absence, but questions about that sort of thing were saved for after the service. Everyone gathered together at a local VFW hall to support the family and have refreshments. After dinner, Judy broke the news to the rest of the family. John and Shelly were missing, and the sheriff's office was now involved. Together, they hoped for the best and wondered if perhaps the couple had decided to take time away to deal with their emotions and for John to put himself together, but they knew deep down he wouldn't have missed his beloved twin sister's funeral for anything. And beyond that, as close as they were to the kids, they certainly wouldn't have gone without so much as a call or a note. Something wasn't right, and the dark cloud which had hung over the Markleys for the previous few years appeared to be growing darker. Tom Yeager would later comment to the Daily Advocate, explaining, quote, "With 4 young girls and a boy living in a rural area, they just didn't take any chances with their kids. For them to just come up missing, no matter how distraught he would have been for the loss of his twin sister, they would have let somebody know." Early in the day on Sunday the 17th, deputies patrolling the northeastern section of the city of Warren quickly spotted a truck which matched the description of John and Shelly's 1990 red over silver Chevy. The truck was located in the parking lot of what was then a Stambaugh's hardware store at 3850 Elm Road Northeast, approximately 15 miles southeast from the family home. After running the plate to confirm the truck did in fact belong to the Markleys, deputies began examining the vehicle itself. They noted that it appeared to be coated in a dirty, dusty film, suggesting it had been driven off-road somewhere. The truck was actually so coated in dirt that someone had used their finger to write "Wash Me" on one of the doors. According to family members, though the truck wasn't in the greatest shape, John and Shelly were not in the habit of driving it off-road, nor did they typically allow for layers of dirt and filth to build up. The doors to the truck were locked, and the keys were nowhere to be found. In fact, they have never been found. After gaining entry to the vehicle, deputies reported they saw no signs of a struggle in or around the truck. Few items were actually recovered, but deputies noted that the Markleys' cell phone was discovered sitting on the center console. In the bed of the vehicle was a tire for a semi-truck, and just beneath it, the 2 missing tarps which had previously covered John's Corvette, one blue and one green. After securing the truck, it was impounded by the sheriff's office and a full and thorough sweep for evidence was conducted. Unfortunately, nothing of evidentiary value was found, not even an unidentified fingerprint or hair. While finding the truck gave them some concept of where the Markleys may have been in the hours following their disappearance, it did little to advance the investigation. Deputies did go to the hardware store and speak to employees, but none of them could say when nor for how long the truck had been parked there, let alone who had been driving it. Later in the day, 2 deputies, Jane Timko and Roger Gregory, were dispatched to the home on Greenville Road to interview family members and neighbors and to walk the house in search of potential clues. Frustratingly, the pursuit for clues was cut short when investigators discovered that, in the days after the disappearance, family members had been in and out of the house looking after the children and had actually cleaned up much of the house, eliminating whatever potential evidence had been left behind. Clothing was put away, beds made, paperwork returned to the safe, which was closed and locked, and the coffee pot was cleaned. No one could say with any certainty what exactly, if anything, was missing from the home. When investigators examined the gun cabinet, they found it empty, but no one was certain how many, if any, guns had been in there at the time of the disappearance. John had previously collected guns, but his mother, Ruth, informed detectives that he had recently sold some of his weapons for extra cash, and she could not confirm if he had kept any of them or if he'd sold them all off. Another brick wall to the deputies. While this certainly impacted the development of the investigation, Deputies felt there was enough known to believe that John and Shelly were more likely in some kind of danger rather than just going off on their own. Shelly was described as a pack-a-day smoker, but had left behind her cigarettes. In addition to that, the couple had just recently fully stocked their freezer for the winter, something that seemed an odd choice if they were planning on running off. Officer Timko and Gregory spent the vast majority of their shifts that day speaking to the family and checking around the house. Ultimately, all that could be determined was that John and Shelly's checkbook appeared to be missing. It wasn't much, but it gave them a direction to go. While the two deputies were with the family, their sergeant accompanied firefighters on a search of the surrounding area. Judy and Tom Yeager gathered up friends and family in a number totaling approximately 100 people and began a large search combing through hundreds of acres of property which surrounded the rural home. When boots on the ground failed to turn anything up, an air search was launched, which targeted the home and surrounding areas, including Bristolville, Champion, Farmington, and Holland. Although nothing was found during these searches, the family stated that they were planning more searches for the future and were considering putting together a reward for information or assistance. Asked about the children, Tom Yeager explained that they were doing as well as could be expected and that the family were trying to figure out how to keep them in their home, not wanting to cause further trauma by relocating them. The Yeagers were considering selling their own home to move into the Markleys with the kids, should John and Shelly go unlocated. Following up on the missing checkbook, deputies examined data from the couple's bank and quickly learned that the last transaction had occurred on Friday, December 15th at 10:36 a.m., just over 2 hours after Shelly had put Johnny on the bus. A personal check made out to cash and signed by Shelly was cashed for $1,000, leaving only $865 in the account. The bank was located in Bloomfield at the intersections of Ohio 87 and 45, a little over 7 miles north of the family home. Deputies arrived at the bank, today a hardware store, and sat down to interview the teller who'd been working the drive-up window the day of the disappearance. She relayed to investigators that the red over silver Chevy drove up to the window and Shelly wrote out and signed the check right there on the dashboard. She informed detectives that John was in the driver's seat while Shelly sat in the middle, wedged between him and another man she was unable to identify. Given the passage of several days and how busy the bank generally was on a Friday, she couldn't remember a great deal about the unknown man. Ultimately, she was only able to describe him to investigators as a dark-haired man with a slender build. It wasn't much to go on, and apparently, there were no cameras covering the drive-through window at that time. Discovery of the bank transaction and what few details they could obtain about the unknown man were the last solid pieces of information investigators were able to uncover at the time. Though they continued speaking to friends, family, and neighbors, the case was already beginning to grow cold. The holidays were coming, and at least for little Johnny, his Christmas list was only one sentence long and read, "All I want for Christmas is Mom and Dad." Tuesday, December 19th, was a snow day at school, and so several family members gathered at the Markleys' home and brought in a tree for decorating, doing the best they could to keep up some semblance of normalcy for the children. John's sister, Linda Mason, and her husband, Gene, traveled up from their home in Salisbury, North Carolina, and began staying in the home on Greenville Road, pitching in to help Judy and Tom take care of the children and hoping to contribute to the search for John and Shelly. Sheriff's deputies visited the home on this same Tuesday, speaking with the family and looking for additional information, but no one had learned anything new. Trumbull County Sheriff Thomas Altier noted that they were doing all they could to try and find the missing couple. However, given the lack of evidence, it was beginning to look grim, as Altier explained to the Tribune Chronicle, saying, quote, "They've never left like this before. It's a tough one. We're suspecting foul play until we find out that they're okay. We're looking at the worst right now." Sheriff Altier told reporters that they put out a message over the teletype to all law enforcement agencies in Ohio and surrounding states about the disappearance, and they had included physical descriptions of both John and Shelly. Though the family were trying to stay positive and keep their hopes up, if for nothing less than the sake of the children, the longer they went without answers, the harder it became. Linda explained they thought maybe John was just so upset he needed time. She stated, quote, "He was very bitter about his sister's death. He blamed everybody. He blamed the doctors. He blamed God. I was hoping he just couldn't cope and had to get away for a while. But now that it's been this long, investigators aren't ruling out foul play." Sadly, Christmas came and went with no new information about John and Shelly. The family did the best they could to band together and support the children, celebrating the holiday as much as one can, given the circumstances. On Wednesday, December 27th, 12 days since the couple vanished, sheriff's deputies with few, if any, leads once again visited the family and re-interviewed friends and neighbors, hoping for something new, but there was nothing to find. Ruth, John's mother, told police that while they could not be entirely sure, they thought that some Christmas presents were missing from the home. Reportedly, the children had found them while snooping around in the days before the disappearance, but when it came time to open everything, certain items were missing. The family were at that point beginning to grow desperate. With the regular investigation failing to develop any solid leads or clues as to John and Shelly's whereabouts or who may have taken them, some members of the family began considering more unusual methods to try and track down the missing couple. Linda Mason explained, quote, "We are seriously thinking about getting a psychic to come in. At this point, we are willing to do anything that will give us a lead. From what I've heard, there are some really terrific ones that have helped the police before." Just a few days after Christmas, though, this story would take an extremely bizarre turn, leading into a series of events that felt more like something out of a poor quality crime movie rather than a real-life investigation into missing persons. It all started with a phone call. On or around Thursday, December 28th, in the evening, the phone started ringing in the Markley home and was answered by the children's uncle, Gene Mason. The person on the other end of the line, an older-sounding man with a raspy voice, specifically asked to speak to Ruth, the eldest of John and Shelly's children. When Gene told the caller that Ruth was asleep, the unknown man requested to speak to John's sister. Though he didn't seem to know her name, it is believed that he must have meant Linda. Gene explained that she was also sleeping and offered to take a message, but the caller said nothing more and then hung up. At the time, Gene thought little of it. People had been calling at all times hoping for news of the missing couple, family, friends, and neighbors. On Friday, December 29th, exactly 2 weeks after John and Shelly's disappearance, Linda was home when the phone started ringing. She picked it up, and on the other end it was again the raspy-voiced man. This time, he had a lot to say. According to Linda, the man claimed to be holding John and Shelly hostage. He told her that they would be sacrificed to a cult on New Year's Eve unless he was paid $10,000 in cash. After making the ransom demand, the unknown caller abruptly ended the call. A few minutes later, the phone rang again, and again it was the raspy-voiced man. Apparently, having forgotten his final point on the previous call, the man told Linda that if they couldn't come up with the $10,000, they could always sell John's Corvette to raise the money. Then he hung up again. Moments after the second call ended, Linda called the Trumbull County Sheriff's Office and explained the situation to Detective Wayne Cardarelli. He supplied Linda with a device that, when attached to the phone, would allow for her to record the next call, and they had 10,000 reasons to expect there would be another call. Saturday the 30th passed with no contact from the raspy-voiced man, but he wouldn't stay quiet for long. On the morning of Sunday, New Year's Eve, the phone started ringing again, and this time Gene was present and made sure to flip on the recording device before answering. It was the raspy-voiced man, and he had instructions for Gene. He told him to go to a Rally's fast food restaurant located just off Ohio 422 at the southeast corner of the Eastwood Mall in Niles, approximately 20 miles southeast of the home on Greenville Road. The caller continued, telling Gene that after arriving at the restaurant, he was to retrieve a note which had been tucked into the coin slot of a payphone. That note would give him further instructions as to where and how to deliver the $10,000 in cash to ensure the return of John and Shelly. Gene and Detective Cardarelli left for the restaurant in separate vehicles, and it was actually the officer who arrived first. Reaching into the coin return, he pulled out a wadded-up piece of paper and handed it to Gene. The note, filled with misspellings, was handwritten in big block letters and read as follows.
Go to Kaufman's entrance next to mall entrance. Park in front next to sidewalk. Once inside door, go left to sweatshirts with penguin bird on them. Put package between shirts and leave by same door. Then drive to back of JCPenney entrance. Go into telephone next to restrooms. Wait 15 minutes. If no law is seen, a boy will give you a note with the address. If any law or anything doesn't look right, go back and get package, because no deal.
Detective Cardarelli handed Gene a paper bag and filled it with dish towels to simulate the approximate weight and appearance of being stuffed with $10,000 in cash. Gene went into the store and stashed the bag as he had been instructed, and then proceeded on with the rest of the directions, walking back out the door he had come in. All the while, Detective Michael Davis, dressed in plain clothes, was inside the store watching and waiting. The bag had been placed between the sweatshirts with the penguin on them, which Detective David quickly identified as the Youngstown University mascot. A few moments later, a man, a woman, and a boy stopped and looked at the sweatshirts, but then moved on without looking for or touching the fake bag of money. Gene had proceeded on to the JCPenney, entered the store through the back entrance, and was sitting by the telephone next to the restroom. He waited the 15 minutes he had been advised to, but no boy ever came by with a note. Because of this, he assumed something had gone wrong and began making his way back towards Kaufman's to retrieve the bag, as the note had instructed him to do. Exiting the store, once again, bag in hand, he spoke briefly with Detective Cardarelli, but neither had any idea what could have gone wrong or why the caller hadn't made the pickup. At the time, they assumed he was delayed or something else had gone wrong, and so they decided to repeat the process, with Gene entering again, putting the bag between the sweatshirts, and then driving back to JCPenney to wait for the call. Around this time, Detective Cardarelli was contacted over his police radio and informed that moments earlier, Linda Mason received a call back at the Markley residence. It was the raspy-voiced man, and he was agitated, apparently saying to Linda, "Where is he at? I see the cops. You people are not following my directions." New instructions were delivered by the caller, who now directed Gene to leave the mall and drive half a mile west along Ohio 422. At the corner of 422 and North Road Southeast, there was an old gas station and convenience store, McQuaid's Sunoco, and this would be the new drop spot for the money. Gene was told to leave the bag of money in the restroom and did as he was instructed. Meanwhile, Detective Cardarelli pulled into the parking lot of the Niles Plaza Shopping Center, which was connected to the rear exit of the filling station. Sitting in his car less than 50 yards from the Sunoco, Cardarelli had an unobstructed view of the restroom door, which was on the rear side of the structure and accessible from the outside. There were several other deputies in the area keeping out of sight and waiting for Cardarelli's call to move in should the suspect show up. It was a cold afternoon and was only growing colder, and while the detective kept his eyes focused on that bathroom door, he noticed it had started snowing. Less than 10 minutes after Gene had left the bag, Detective Cardarelli observed an unknown individual dressed in a hooded jacket entering the bathroom. Moments later, the figure emerged, and nearly simultaneously a white car with a man behind the wheel pulled around and stopped, waiting for the person in the hooded jacket. The figure moved quickly and climbed into the car, at which time Cardarelli gave the order, and before he could even pull out from the gas station, multiple sheriff's deputies surrounded the car, commanding everyone inside to put their hands up and for the driver to shut the engine off. Deputies quickly identified the driver as 45-year-old Stephen Durst of the city of Warren. Detective Davis, who had been inside the Kaufmans for the original drop, confirmed that Durst was the man he had seen approach the clothing rack after Jean had left the money bag behind. Also in the car was Durst's teenage daughter. It was she who was wearing the hooded jacket and had originally entered the restroom. Neither of the Markleys were present in the car, and neither was the fake money bag. It was still inside the bathroom. As it would turn out, Durst was not just some random person trying to cash in on the Markleys' misfortunes. He had a history with the family, in particular John, and things had not ended well between the two former friends. Durst, also a truck driver, had fallen on hard times a year prior to the Markleys' disappearance. Wanting to help out his friend, John not only gave Durst a job driving his other semi, he also allowed him and his two children to share the home on Greenville Road. Something went wrong during the summer of '95, 6 months before the disappearance, and the two had a heated dispute over money. Things went so poorly that John ended up firing Durst and telling him that he and his children needed to find a new place to live because they were no longer welcome in his home. According to the family, John was so angry with Durst that he withheld his final paycheck, which was for $1,000. Durst made a lot of noise about that $1,000 and said he was going to get it one way or the other. Detective Timko explained, quote, "Durst was out of work when the Markleys disappeared. He told a lot of people that the Markleys owed him $1,000. Durst was placed under arrest and charged with extortion. He was held in the Trumbull County Jail on $15,000 bond. Although she had been present at the scene, Durst's daughter, 18 at the time, was not charged. Detectives noted that she had been very cooperative with them and did not appear to have any knowledge of the extortion plot her father was carrying out. On Wednesday, January 3rd, 1996, Durst pleaded not guilty to felony extortion in Niles Municipal Court and was remanded pending the posting of bond. Investigators were unsure at the time as to whether Durst actually was involved in John and Shelly's disappearance or if he was merely trying to take advantage of a terrible situation to get that $1,000 he claims he was owed. Even without solid evidence of his involvement, it was hard to dismiss the coincidence between his anger over $1,000 and the $1,000 check the Markleys cashed the morning of their disappearance in the company of an unknown man. However, there was one thing there was no doubt about. Durst had tried to extort the family. Sheriff Altier explained, saying, quote, "We have a tape recorder that we gave to the family. This Stephen Durst called and told them to take $10,000 in a brown paper bag to the Eastwood Mall area on Sunday. He said he did have the whereabouts of the Markleys." After being released from jail on bond while awaiting his extortion trial, Durst apparently decided that he needed to do whatever was possible to prove his innocence, not just of the extortion, but of any involvement in John and Shelly's disappearance. According to the plane dealer, Durst was asked if he would be willing to take a polygraph examination, and he agreed to do so. Now, while this is reported as a voluntary choice from Durst, later articles from the Tribune-Chronicle suggest he agreed to take the polygraph because prosecutors had offered up a plea deal. Durst would serve a shorter sentence, perhaps even just parole, if he could be cleared of involvement in the disappearance. At the time, he was facing 4 to 10 years in federal prison were he to be found guilty, and the smart money was to roll the dice and go along with the polygraph. William D. Evans was a polygraph examiner from the Akron area, and he was brought to Trumbull County to conduct the exam. Evans ultimately determined that Durst failed the polygraph and showed deception on questions revolving around John and Shelly's fate. The test was not conclusive enough to narrow down the deception to one specific question, with Evans noting it could have been any of the following 4 questions. Were you involved in John and Shelly Markley's disappearance in any way? Did you see John and Shelly Markley after they were reported missing? Do you know where John and Shelly are now? Did you know in advance that John and Shelly Markley disappeared? Now, regardless of one's feelings towards the reliability of polygraph examinations, I've made it clear many times that I don't believe them to be scientifically reliable. The suggestion that Durst failed the test resulted in a sort of cognitive dissonance for law enforcement. On the one hand, they had the so-called failure, which would lead one to presume that Durst either possessed some knowledge about the crime or was directly involved in it. But two law enforcement sources within the sheriff's office stated publicly that they did not believe Durst was involved. One of those voices was that of Sheriff's Detective James Phillips, and the other, surprisingly, was that of Sheriff Altier himself, who stated, quote, "There's nothing we've found that would lead us to believe he has any involvement." It was theorized at the time that Durst had become aware of the disappearance and hoped to take advantage of the situation to his own financial gain, but that he was not responsible for the disappearance itself. This was a controversial take, though, with other investigators and members of the family expressing their belief that Durst knew much more than he was saying. Then lead investigator Detective Jane Timko noted, quote, "Since he's failed the polygraph, it indicates that he knows something about them." The entire legal fiasco revolving around Durst and the extortion charge lasted 4 months, and during that time, multiple searches were launched seeking out John and Shelly, but none of them resulted in any new leads or pieces of evidence. The sheriff's office made it clear that while they had some leads left to pursue, nothing was very concrete, and due to that, they wouldn't reveal additional information about what led to the searches nor the locations at which they were conducted. In the midst of all of the chaos, there was another court hearing with ramifications involving custody of John and Shelly's 5 children. In June of 1996, a family court placed the Markley children into the custody of Judy and Tom Yeager. They were apparently somewhat surprised by the decision, since up until that point, Linda and Jean Mason had been living with and looking after the kids. Uncertain of their ability, Judy commented to the judge that at 46 years old, she wasn't sure she was even capable of becoming a full-time mother to 5 children. The judge, leaning forward in his chair, looked down at Judy and commented, quote, "Well, you don't know what you can do until you have to do it." And the matter was settled. It was by far not an easy thing to do for the Yeagers. For the first week or so, the 4 girls shared one bedroom while Johnny used the other. Money was tight, and so the couple relied on public assistance, donations, and help from friends and family. It was certainly difficult, but the more time went on, the more things seemed to fall into place, and the Yeagers found themselves making it work better than they could have imagined. By the end of July, more than a month after the ruling, Judy and Tom had started to see the kids as their own, and the children were adjusting as good as could be expected. They were provided with counseling to help them deal with this dramatic and unexpected shift in their lives, but they admitted to their new caretakers that they still held out hope that one day their mother and father would reappear. 1 month later, in August of '96, Durst would finally get his day in court, some 8 months since John and Shelly had vanished. At the time, Durst was represented by Warren area defense attorney George Kafantaris. In his mind, at least, his client was innocent, and law enforcement had presented a poor case. Kafantaris argued that Durst's presence at the Sunoco the day of the extortion attempt was purely coincidental, though the prosecution easily dismantled that argument. Reportedly, there was an audio recording of a member of the Markley family who, upon hearing the recording of the extortion caller, not only failed to identify that man as Durst, but actually gave a different name entirely. It was also alleged that Jean Mason had stated that he could not say conclusively that the man he'd spoken to on the phone was Stephen Durst. Kafantaris argued passionately that investigators weren't even sure if the caller was Durst, noting that they had elected not to create a digital voice stamp of the call, which could then be scientifically compared to recordings of Durst. The reason law enforcement had chosen not to do this, Kafantaris suggested, was because they knew the test would prove that Durst had not been the one making the calls. The jury, though, weren't buying what the defense was selling, and after just 2.5 hours of deliberation, they found Durst guilty of extortion. Kafantaris would later comment that his client was a victim of circumstance, someone who was being punished not because he was guilty, but because the jury wanted to see someone pay for what had happened to the Markleys. To Kafantaris, they found Durst guilty on extortion not because of evidence, but because they believed he was involved in the disappearance. Durst's sentencing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on the morning of Tuesday, September 3rd. Much of the Markley family was present in the courtroom that day, including John and Shelly's oldest, Ruth, who was then 16 and took the day off from school to attend. Durst allowed an opportunity to speak before sentencing, begged the judge for leniency, arguing that he was just a good family man caught up in a crazy situation. Durst stated, quote, "I am not a habitual criminal. I just want to raise my children. Since this case has happened, I have lost 2 jobs and I have had my children taken from me. I have lost my home. I have been brought down to the bottom. I don't think incarceration of any term is going to do anything for my character." Well, he was probably right about that. Judge Andrew Logan wasn't interested in Durst's pleas and felt that the man hadn't shown any true regret or sorrow about his involvement in the whole sad affair. He made it clear to the man that it was completely unacceptable to try and make money off someone else's misery, accusing Durst of, quote, "using this unfortunate incident for personal gain." At one point, the judge also brought up the disappearance, admonishing Durst by saying, quote, "I certainly hope that you don't know more on this than you have led everyone to believe." Ultimately, Judge Logan sentenced Durst to 4 to 10 years at the Lorraine Correctional Institution. Durst would appeal his conviction 2 years later, but the appellate court would deny his claim. While the family reacted with mostly celebratory responses, there was some concern in the courtroom. John's mother, Ruth, wondered if this might have sealed the fate for her son and his wife, telling the Tribune Chronicle, quote, "It scares me. What if he had them and he was giving them maybe a piece of bread and water each day? Now that he's in jail, they're not getting anything." Law enforcement, however, expressed optimism that, with Durst locked behind bars, people with knowledge of his alleged involvement in the disappearance might feel more comfortable coming forward. Detective Timko reported that just after he was found guilty, they received several calls from people looking to share information about Durst and his activities, whereas before, Timko reported that people were afraid of him and refused to cooperate. She hoped there would be more calls to come. She remained laser-focused on Durst, telling the plain dealer, quote, "I truly believe that Stephen Durst knows what happened to them, and he just won't say." When Assistant Prosecutor Debbie Smith was asked about Durst's potential role in the crime, she replied, quote, "That is the whole mystery. I think this conviction will help in the investigation. I think there's got to be someone out there that knows more, and now that he's in jail, that information should come more freely." Unfortunately, while Timko did receive new calls over the next few months, most of them were unhelpful, and by the beginning of 1997, the only people still reaching out were so-called psychics. Detective Timko noted that 3 of these charlatans claimed to envision the couple either dead and in the dark or down beneath the water somewhere. One claimed to have a vision of the couple in an abandoned farmhouse on the Ohio-Indiana border. Though Detective Timko follows up on all tips, there was little to work with, and she did the best she could. She sent divers into the murky waters of an abandoned quarry, cadaver dogs through fields and along shorelines, and Indiana law enforcement searched a dozen unoccupied or abandoned farmhouses, finding nothing connected to John or Shelly. It was often back to the drawing board, wondering what they had missed, what clue might completely change the direction of the investigation. Timko has a lot of different thoughts, sometimes wondering if it was less of a personal crime and something more to do with John's trucking, maybe. Her thoughts were always evolving as she explained, quote, "There are so many maybes, Today I feel this happened. Tomorrow I could feel entirely different. By October of 1997, 22 months had passed, and law enforcement did not appear to be any closer to finding John, Shelly, or any answers as to who may have been involved in their disappearance. Desperate for something, anything to run with, Judy Yeager agreed to appear on an episode of The Montel Williams Show alongside alleged psychic Sylvia Browne, whose most notorious claim to fame may be when she told a mother on television in front of a live studio audience that her missing daughter, Amanda Berry, was dead. Amanda's mother went to her grave believing that, only for the missing woman to escape her captors and later acknowledge she had actually seen the show in which Sylvia told her mother she was dead. Browne had previously done the same when she told the parents of missing teenager Sean Hornbeck that he was dead and his body would be found near two jagged boulders. She claimed he had been abducted by a dark-skinned man with dreadlocks. 5 years later, Sean was found alive, and it turned out he had been abducted by a Caucasian man with short hair. One could easily do an entire series of podcast episodes about the lies and deceptions of Sylvia Browne, perhaps one of the only human beings less reliable than a polygraph test, but I digress. During her appearance on the show, Judy was informed by Browne that John and Shelly's remains could be found along the banks of a creek or drainage ditch not far from Bowling Green, Ohio, located more than 150 miles west of the home on Greenville Road. She further stated that the location carried the name of two minor presidents, Jackson and Taylor. Armed with this information, 6 members of the family approached Sheriff John Cole of Wood County, where Bowling Green is located, and requested his department's assistance in searching for the missing couple. Cole, who noted he wasn't sure he believed in the accuracy of psychics, agreed to search, saying that you just never know what can happen. The target area for the search was Jackson Cutoff, a large culvert that runs through Weston and intersects with Taylor Street, bringing together the Jackson and Taylor reference of Browne. A thorough search of the area was carried out by sheriff's deputies and members of the family, but nothing was found. Sheriff's Detective Chuck Frizzell noted that they had considered the search unlikely to yield results, but it was worth trying. He would comment to the Sentinel Tribune saying, quote, "If they were there, it'd be hard to find anything after this long. But with the family still looking and wondering, I guess you almost have to do something." Despite the lack of results, Judy and Tom were highly complimentary of Sheriff Cole for listening to their pleas and doing what he could to help them, where other law enforcement officers might have just dismissed them as wackos. It was another dead end for Judy and Tom, who had spent a lot of their free time over the previous 2 years searching everywhere they could think of and any place anyone suggested. They were desperate for answers and to find John and Shelly, but never did it seem to pan out. Wherever the couple were, it seemed they were extremely well hidden. Asked about their searches, Judy would reply, quote, "Anytime someone calls us with any information that can help us find them, we drop what we're doing and we go. We're at the point where we're looking at any kind of lead at all. We'd like to put this all behind us and put it to rest for the kids. They need to put this in the past so they can get on with their lives. They need some sense of closure." For the most part, this is where the major developments, if you can even call them that, come to a stop. Though law enforcement continued to work it and would track down all tips and leads delivered to them, nothing ever seemed to advance the investigation. Soon, days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years. Life moved forward, regardless of concern or appeal, and each subsequent year the holiday season would bring with it reminders of a dark past that can never be fully illuminated until John and Shelly are found, their fate determined, and their abductor and likely killer arrested and charged. Few, if any, believe that they are alive out there somewhere, with most accepting they were likely killed before they were even reported missing. Tuesday, December 15th, 2015, marked 20 years since the Markleys disappeared. With 2 decades past, The case had moved through the hands of different investigators, and now the files were on the desk of Detective Tom Stewart. Since taking over, Stewart had put in a lot of work, revisiting witnesses and examining what evidence they did possess, mostly papers and documents held in 2 large banker's boxes. The pickup truck, discovered in the days after the disappearance, was still in the possession of law enforcement, and they were using new, more advanced technology to search for potential missed evidence or DNA. Sheriff Altier was clear that, despite the passage of time, the case was still active and he was determined to break it open. But he was also open about the fact that they would need assistance from the public. He explained to WFMJ-21 NBC News, saying, quote, "This has been on my mind for 20 years, this case. As a matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago, we got some more leads on this, and it's funny because now it's the 20-year anniversary. We have interviewed 3 people last week, and we're looking for 3 more people to interview. We just need that one tidbit to come up with, and we can hopefully do some indictments." Despite the new interviews, nothing appeared to come out of it, and Detective Stewart noted that the investigation was still hitting a roadblock. The last news coverage about this case was in July of 2021, more than 25 years since John and Shelly were last seen alive. Things were difficult for their children in the years following the disappearance, and while they were loved and cared for by relatives, there's no way to truly substitute for someone's parents, especially when their ultimate fate remains unknown. It becomes a broken door, unable to fully close on a past that cannot be confronted. Months earlier, in late 2020, the family had John and Shelly officially declared dead. Stacy, the couple's second oldest daughter, felt like she hadn't been fully able to grasp it all, but in the aftermath, she had to adjust. She commented to the Morning Journal saying, quote, "I know I'm still a kid, but I see things differently. We were made to grow up fast." Ruthie, the oldest of the children, married and started her own family. She would eventually move back into the Greenville Road home alongside her husband. They would be joined by 2 of her sisters, living back together in a home that had once been at the center of their lives. It was a different kind of feeling, but there was a certain therapy in revisiting old haunts and peeling back the bandages from wounds that had never fully healed. For Ruthie, she sacrificed much of her youth. Being the oldest, she explained that family members, no matter how well-meaning, had placed a great deal of pressure on her, expressing how important it was that she stay strong for her brother and sisters, but that left little room to face her own pain. At the same time, the search for their parents and for the truth could not be dismissed. In fact, several of the sisters noted it was necessary for them. They were unified in saying that it was the unknown that had made things so hard for them, the lack of answers that kept them from being able to fully move forward as they believed their parents would have wanted them to. Asked about that, Ruthie replied, quote, "I told myself, you've got to turn cold. That's how I'll deal with it. Even if we find out they're dead, it'll be over." Surely, they believe, someone out there has the ability to provide them with the truth, to help alleviate the pain they've lived with for the majority of their lives, and to finally bring their parents home, to lay them to rest, to see the promise of a new tomorrow. When last seen, John Markley was described as being a white male with brown hair and green eyes, standing 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighing approximately 150 to 170 pounds. John has a mole and a scar on his back and a scar on his right forearm. He is thought to have been carrying a pocket knife, a black Peterbilt brand knife case, and a cigarette lighter. He was last seen at the home on Greenville Road on the morning of Friday, December 15, 1995. Shelly Renee Markley is described as being a white female with brown hair and blue eyes, standing 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing approximately 125 pounds. She has freckles, a scar on her right forearm, and both ears are pierced. She is thought to have been wearing stud earrings and a round gold ring with 2 diamonds. She was a pack-a-day smoker at the time, with her brand being Marlboro Reds. At the time of their disappearance, John was 36 and Shelly 31. If alive today, they would be 65 and 61 years old, respectively. They were last seen in the vicinity of the former bank, now a hardware store, on Painesville-Warren State Road in North Bloomfield. They were sitting in their red over silver 1990 Chevy Fleetwood 4x4 with a cellular antenna and a loud muffler alongside a third unidentified man. He has only ever been described as a white male, slender in build, with dark hair. The truck was later found abandoned in the parking lot of the former Stambaugh's hardware store, located then at 3850 Elm Road Northeast in the city of Warren. This December will mark 30 years since Shelly Markley walked her 8-year-old son to his bus stop and then vanished off the face of the earth along with her husband John. The house was left in disarray, suggesting a quick exit and likely not one of their own choosing. The couple disappeared on the same day as their son's birthday and the wake for John's beloved twin sister Bonnie, two events that no one in the family believed they would have ever missed unless they were forced to. Over the last 3 decades, their children were forced to grow up quickly and learned all too soon about the nameless, faceless evil in the world that will steal your family away from you and never pay the price. There is little doubt someone out there knows more, but what exactly has kept them quiet all these years and who or what they're protecting is a mystery all of its own. Someone stole John and Shelly's lives. They robbed their children of their family, shattered their bonds, and left them orphaned for something as paltry as a matter of $1,000. Anyone who would protect a monster like that has already become a monster themselves. The disappearance of John and Shelly Markley is a strange case with a lot of different twists and turns. 2 grown adults, parents of 5, in the midst of a family tragedy, mysteriously disappear from their home, which is left in such a state as to suggest they left rapidly. So fast, in fact, that they left the coffee pot brewing, papers strewn about, safes open and unlocked, and beds completely unmade. It appeared clear from the first moments that this was not a case of 2 people running off for some reason. Sure, some have argued that perhaps John was struggling emotionally with the loss of his sister, as several family members attested to, but that doesn't exactly fit in with the known details either. His sister died 2 days earlier. He and Shelly were selecting the clothes they would wear to her wake, and then what? Sometime after putting their son on the bus on what happened to be his 8th birthday, they just decided to hit the road, leaving behind no notes, no directions, and never calling to check in? Though there is always a subsect of people who actually believe this is a possibility, logic and reason are fairly powerful in their ability to overcome this theory, marking it as little more than a remote, if not extremely unlikely scenario. Running off, whether it's for a short period of time or for what has now extended into nearly 30 years, typically is not a spur-of-the-moment decision, especially when you've got a home, a company, and 5 children who depend on you. Now, to a degree, I understand initial theories and beliefs of family members that maybe John, so heartbroken and devastated by the loss, might have wanted a little time to get his head together, to get away from it all. And Shelly, being the devoted and loving wife she was, may have wanted to go along with him. When the kids first arrived home and found the house empty, even they theorized that maybe their parents had chosen to take a long drive to give themselves the ability to decompress. But as the hours slowly ticked by, it became apparent to everyone that knew the Markleys that they would never purposefully abandon their children, let alone to leave everything they owned behind. For those who still considered it probable, they were never able to explain to what end this plan was executed. It seems very clear today, with 3 decades to look back on in retrospect, that running away is not only an extremely unlikely theory today, it was a pretty far-fetched one back in December of '95. To their credit, law enforcement didn't entertain that possibility for very long. Once they were informed of the disappearance approximately 16 hours after they were last seen, they established pretty quickly that this was likely a case of foul play. To them, not a whole lot about it made sense, and given what else was going on, there had to be something or someone keeping John and Shelly from coming home. Unfortunately, it was difficult to determine too much of what may have happened due to a severe lack of physical evidence. The crime scene, as it were, was the family home on Greenville Road. Whatever happened that cold Friday in December started there, sometime in the 90 or so minutes between Shelly putting Johnny on the school bus around 8:30 a.m. and the bank teller cashing the check for them at 10:36. It seemed most likely that someone, or perhaps multiple people, somehow gained entry to the family home that morning, most likely armed, and took control of the missing couple. While the crime scene had been cleaned up and therefore essentially swept clean of valuable forensic data, a la Jean-Benet Ramsey, although I don't believe this is a case that has room for speculation that someone in the home was responsible, what we were told about the condition of the home spoke volumes. Obviously, someone besides John and Shelly was there that day, though for what reason no one has ever been able to clarify. We all know that the safe was open, the lockbox was removed and sifted through, the gun cabinet, which was always locked, was also accessed, and although it was found empty by the children later in the day, there's no accounting for what nor how many guns may have been inside of it, if any at all. The coffee pot was left on and had nearly brewed itself dry. John's prized watch was left behind, and Shelly, a chain smoker, leaves her cigarettes and lighter on the counter. It all seems to point to the same kind of a situation. Someone came into the home, was looking for something specific, likely money or items of value, and after being unsuccessful in their bid, they forced John and Shelly out into their own truck for a quick trip to the bank. There, Shelly writes out a $1,000 check to cash from a $1,865 account, and they're never seen again. The teller, who was somewhat familiar with the Markleys as frequent customers, spots another man in the truck with them, a dark-haired man with a slender build. Unfortunately, it's a quick transaction, and she doesn't pay a great deal of attention to the unknown man, so little, in fact, that she's later unable to identify anyone she is shown a photo of, making it clear she really didn't get much of a look. So, police learn some new details, but it does little to assist them. Maybe, however, they've managed to uncover the motive, that this was all about money. At the same time, abducting two people, forcing them to cash a check for you, and then possibly killing them and disposing of their bodies seems like a lot of work for $1,000, but people have been killed for less. It's also a really strange crime where there was a high likelihood of being caught. Anyone could have seen who was with the Markleys that morning and possibly recognized him. John or Shelly could have said something during the bank that morning to warrant suspicion or to elicit assistance leading to a 911 call. None of that ends up happening, but the risk was there, and at least to me, this doesn't come across like a crime planned and executed by an experienced and skilled criminal. It seems more likely that an opportunity presented itself, perhaps learning about the passing of John's sister, and someone intended to cash in whatever way possible. To me, at least, this has always come across as a crime laden with anger and specifically targeting John and Shelly for personal reasons. Sure, this could have been completely random, but it doesn't feel that way. It's too involved. It's too high profile and way too risky. I don't think a rando would have gone to the bank with the couple to get that $1,000. More likely, I would have expected that Corvette to have been taken and the Markleys themselves to have been killed inside of their home, leading to a grisly discovery later in the day. I've often wondered how things may have been different if they had had the cash in the house that morning, if they were able to just hand it to the suspect. Would he still have felt the need to kill them? Though it's impossible to say with any certainty, the fact that the two tarps were stripped off of the Corvette and taken along in the truck suggests some type of planning in regard to disposing of the bodies or concealing them. But then those very tarps are found in the bed of the truck, and it's just another piece of evidence that doesn't make sense. There have never been any reports of blood evidence or DNA being recovered from the tarps, so what exactly their purpose was and why they were taken is just another part of this inexplicable mystery. The truck is found in the parking lot of what used to be a hardware store on the northeastern end of the city of Warren, Shelly's hometown. Police note that the vehicle is covered in dirt and dust, suggesting it was driven off-road, and all members of the Markley family comment that this is inconsistent with John and Shelly's typical behaviors. It's also the discovery of this truck that is often noted as the final dagger in any potential running away theory, as it would be fairly difficult for the couple to get much of anywhere without their vehicle and perhaps carrying just $1,000 in cash, although nobody actually believes that check was cash for their personal use. In the truck, police find the couple's cell phone, an expensive commodity in 1995, a spare tire for one of John's semis, and the two previously missing tarps laying in the bed with the tire on top of them. No signs of a struggle, no traces of blood or hair, not even an out-of-place fingerprint. There's no sign that whoever was responsible for their disappearance had wiped down the interior, so it seems more likely this person wore gloves or was extremely careful not to touch anything. From there, we simply don't know anything more. For the most part, it's theorized that whoever left the truck in that parking lot was involved in the disappearance. There's no belief that John or Shelly were still there when it was left. Something I've always thought about when thinking about the details of how this crime was committed is the killer's method of getting to the Markleys' residence and then getting away from the truck that afternoon. Sure, it's entirely possible the suspect parked in that same area and simply walked from the truck to his own vehicle, but then you have to ask, how the hell did he get to the Markleys' home some 30 miles away? To me, the answer has always been clear. This is, at a minimum, a two-person job. Someone had to drop the killer off and or pick the killer up after all was said and done. John and Shelly lived in a rural area miles from most signs of life, and the idea that someone walked to the house makes even less sense than them running away of their own volition. So you're looking at least two people, the driver and the suspect who actually enters the home and confronts the Markleys. You have to wonder if the suspect was dropped off and gave instructions on where to later pick him up, or if all along the way, from the home to the bank to wherever they were killed and disposed of, and then to the hardware store parking lot, there was another vehicle following along, driven by the second suspect. Either way, there's no doubt that once news of the Markleys' disappearance hits television and airwaves, and both their home and truck are shown on the news, the person who drove the suspect is becoming completely aware of what happened. Even if they didn't know at the time, they certainly knew within a few days of the crime, and yet no one comes forward. Perhaps, as the DA's office suggested, people were scared to discuss the suspect, or maybe this was someone who was just as deep into the motive and who has as much, if not more, reason to want to see John and Shelly gone. There's really no way of knowing. But I think, in a way, that's pretty much what this comes down to. Maybe the $1,000 was the driving motive that got the wheels turning on this plan, but at the end of the day, this was a double homicide from start to finish. Whoever walked into the Markley home that morning knew that anyone they came upon in that house was not going to live to see the next day. They knew exactly what they were doing, what they were looking for, and how they were going to pull it off. Presumably, they even had a location in mind for the murders and the disposal of the bodies, and considering how much time has passed, they obviously chose a secluded enough location that no trace of the missing couple has ever been found. There is a lot of wide open fields, densely wooded spots, and everything in between in the rural parts of Trumbull County. You're talking thousands of acres of land and water to search, much more than law enforcement could properly carry out in a matter of months, let alone years. The sad truth is, once John and Shelly got into that truck with the killer, everything was basically over for them. One horrifying question that troubles me often is, exactly when did they know that they were going to be killed, that there was no coming back from this? Somewhere along that drive, it must have dawned on them, one by one or simultaneously, that they weren't going to make it. It's a terrible fate, and the minutes must have ticked by like hours as they persisted, mile by mile, towards their final moments. Another question I've seen asked in several places and I've often wondered about myself is why John and Shelly went along with the suspect's plan. Now, surely you could argue they were being held at gunpoint or at the end of some other weapon, and they were simply scared and did what they were told to do because they wanted to get things over with as quickly as possible. I'm not trying to discard that theory. I think it's as reasonable as anything else. But I can't help but wondering if perhaps they went along with everything in order to protect their children. It's been made clear time and time again that John and Shelly were loving and devoted parents who did everything they could to look out for their 4 daughters and 1 son. Perhaps one of them offered up some resistance, and the suspect commented how if they wouldn't go along with things, he would just have to wait for the kids to come home. How far would John and Shelly be willing to go to save their children? All the way to a bloody end, as it would turn out. But there is another possibility, one that I can't get out of my head, and that's the idea that John and Shelly knew the person who showed up at the house on Greenville Road that morning. Not only did they know this person, they had reason to believe that while threatening and demanding money, this person was unlikely to actually kill them. There's a big piece of me that thinks they felt like once they gave this person the money, they'd be taken home and told to keep their mouths shut or some worse fate might befall them. At the same time, it's entirely possible that a personal connection may have actually aggravated the situation. They knew who the suspect was. Even if they promised not to call the police, the killer would likely be unwilling to risk his or her freedom on a promise given by either of them. Hell, for all we know, something was directly stated to the suspect informing him that they were going to make sure he went to prison for this, and that sealed their fate. But I somewhat doubt the latter. As I said earlier, it appears clear to me that murder was always the plan here. There's not exactly a long list of suspects in this case. In fact, there's only one who's ever mentioned by name, and that's John's former friend and employee, Stephen Durst, who just so happened to live in Warren at the time, the same city where the truck was found abandoned. Initially, Durst's name doesn't really come up in the investigation. There's no mentions of him or his previous associations with the family until we become embroiled in that whole attempted extortion fiasco, which is such a ridiculously planned and executed crime that it's difficult to accept someone with so limited brain power could have actually pulled off the double abduction and murder of John and Shelly, but at the same time, there are key details that feed right into it. According to the family, Durst had a previous association with John in that they had worked together and were friends. Sometime in early '95, Durst hits a rough spot financially, and John, out of the goodness of his heart, not only offers Durst a job driving for him, but he allows him to use one of his own trucks because he knows Durst doesn't have one. On top of that, he invites Durst and his children to come live in the house on Greenville Road. Now, details are sparse, but it's reported that sometime in the summer, approximately 5 to 6 months before the disappearance, an argument between John and Durst over money leads to John not only firing Durst, but throwing him and his kids out of the house. It's also reported that, as a result of this argument, John tells Durst that he's not going to issue his final paycheck, totaling some $1,000, and in the months after, Durst apparently makes a lot of noise about John owing him $1,000 and how he's going to get that money one way or another. Now, it also sounds like this guy was generally a bag of hot air, so most people didn't take it seriously until the day John and Shelly disappeared. 2 weeks or so after the disappearance, the family starts getting calls from an unknown man with a raspy voice. He demands $10,000, or $100,000 depending on who you ask, for the safe release of John and Shelly, who he claims to be holding. After a bunch of calls and random threats, this all leads to a so stupid it's almost comical charade involving loading money into a paper bag, dropping it at a mall, waiting for a boy with a note to deliver further instructions. When that doesn't work out, things get changed, and instead the money is supposed to be left in the bathroom of McQuaid Sunoco, a gas station just down the street from the Eastwood Mall. After everything is done and all instructions are followed, Durst shows up with his daughter, who enters the bathroom. When police jump into action, Durst claims ignorance and pretends that he just happened to be at the gas station and he doesn't understand what all the police presence is about. He, of course, forgets that a detective saw him at the mall where the money drop was supposed to be as well. His daughter, who's not as much of a moron as her father, tells law enforcement whatever they need to know and fully cooperates. It's determined that she was unaware of the extortion plan and was merely doing what her father had instructed her to do. Durst still denies involvement, claiming so vehemently that he's innocent and it's just a misunderstanding that he voluntarily takes a polygraph examination. Thinking he's going to be vindicated by a piece of technology that for the most part is considered a flawed and unscientific device, the only thing he manages to prove is that he's even dumber than anyone had given him credit for. Not only does the polygraph not go his way, shocker, the administrator states that it specifically shows signs of deception on basically all of the key questions asked about whether or not Durst was involved in or has any knowledge of John and Shelly's disappearance. In the end, Durst continues to deny any involvement in either crime but is found guilty of extortion and is sentenced to 4 to 10 years in prison. He tries to appeal it a few years later, but his appeal is quickly denied on the basis of there being enough evidence to link him to the extortion that even a jury as dumb as him would have voted to convict. The thing is, after the extortion sentencing, you never hear about Durst again. Some law enforcement officers comment that they don't think he was involved in the disappearance and merely tried to use the situation to his own benefit. Other law enforcement officers state their belief that Durst absolutely knows more about the disappearance and was likely involved, but no one ever comes forward with corroborating information and no solid evidence is ever found to directly connect Durst to that crime. As much as I have suggested that Durst is a moron, if he was involved, he has somehow managed to get away with it. Everything against him is basically circumstantial. There's no smoking gun. He was owed $1,000, and the day of the disappearance, that's the exact amount of money they take out of the bank. John and Shelly are accompanied by an unknown man with dark hair who's described as slender. Durst himself is a dark-haired, slender man. But that's pretty much where the evidence stops, if you can even call it that. Maybe if they had something more to pressure him with, Durst might have talked, or maybe he really wasn't involved, although I personally don't believe that. Digging deeper into Durst, I was able to find 3 addresses associated with him throughout the 1990s, and all of them are within 5 miles of the parking lot where the truck was found. That doesn't necessarily mean he had to have been directly involved in the crime, but it's certainly some more circumstantial evidence to add to an already large pile of facts. To me, Durst is the most likely and key suspect in this case, and for whatever reason, police have never managed to connect him to it. He either kept this crime completely to himself, which I don't think is possible given our previous discussion about needing a ride, or whoever worked with him is dead, or continues nearly 3 decades later to help cover up a crime that robbed 5 children of their parents on the day of their aunt's wake, their little brother's 8th birthday, and just 10 days before Christmas. This isn't just a crime committed by a monster, but one protected by at least one other person who is just as much of a devious, heartless scumbag. There is one other theory, for lack of a better term, I'd like to address before we wrap this episode up, and that involves a man named Milton Kurtzman. In April of 2020, Kurtzman, then 71 and living on property he co-owned in Bristolville, is arrested and charged with felonious assault after he shoots his roommate and caretaker, 64-year-old Alan Byler, multiple times. Byler manages to survive by some miracle, and Kurtzman is taken into custody by Trumbull County deputies and placed in a cell where, less than 24 hours later, he's found dead on the floor. The coroner, who examines the body, determines that Kurtzman's death is as a result of natural causes. He had, in previous years, been struggling with bad health and had suffered some strokes. Friends and neighbors later comment that after the strokes, Kurtzman had become more disagreeable and violent, and in the weeks leading up to the shooting, had multiple clashes with law enforcement, in part about his possession of firearms despite apparent mental decline. I should note, it's interesting that one of his neighbors was named Markley. From the outside, this appears to just be another horrible event which occurs within the borders of Trumbull County, but what many believe may link it to the Markleys' disappearance comes after Kurtzman dies. The Trumbull County Sheriff's Office launches multiple searches on Kurtzman's property, though they will not specify what exactly they're looking for. Instead, they provide vague answers to the possibility of additional crimes carried out on Kurtzman's property. Things really pop off when Sheriff Paul Monroe makes reference to a crime from the past, telling WKBN, CBS News, quote, "There may be additional crimes that occurred on this property and evidence of such which we're trying to recover at this time. This is something that dates back historically 20 years that we're looking at." Now, 20 years would put you at the year 2000, but a lot of people have suggested that what Trumbull County authorities were actually looking for is something connected to John and Shelly. I should note, this is all speculation. I haven't seen a single quote from law enforcement nor any solid evidence to link Kurtzman to John and Shelly's disappearance, but this search stirred up a lot of different theories, and many people have chosen to run with it. When you look into this case, you're undoubtedly going to come across this story, and in many places, it's presented as fact that there is a connection. And while it's an interesting alley to go down, there's not a lot of evidence to be dealt with. Perhaps the most interesting angle of it comes from the fact that Kurtzman lived in and owned land surrounding a home in the 1300 block of Hyde Oakfield Road, just 5 miles from the Greenville Road home. In fact, if one were to leave John and Shelly's home and drive to Kurtzman's, you would pass by the bank where they cashed that $1,000 check the morning of their disappearance. Perhaps another interesting connection comes up when it's learned that Kurtzman had previously worked for the Republic Steel Corporation, which changed names and owners multiple times. It was out of Warren, Ohio, again, the same city in which the Markleys' truck was found abandoned. In fact, the site of the former steel mill was less than 4 miles from that hardware store parking lot. 5 miles from the home, 4 miles from the truck. It's no wonder people have been digging into this theory. At the same time, proximity doesn't exactly mean involvement, but there's a little more left to explore. Although curious, the location isn't the only interesting detail. It's the fact that Kurtzman worked in the steel industry. According to several members of the Markley family, who still very much believe Stephen Durst was involved in the disappearance, his job, prior to being hired by John, was as a trucker hauling steel. Is it possible that Durst and Kurtzman were connected in some way, and maybe law enforcement believed he might have bodies hidden somewhere on his expansive rural property just 5 miles from the Markleys? Maybe, but if true, there have been no solid developments since Kurtzman's death in 2020, and law enforcement have not made any direct references to John or Shelly in relation to that search. I went down this rabbit hole pretty good during research, and while a very interesting angle, I couldn't find a lot of additional information to make any solid connections. From what I can tell, the origin of this possible connection came out of a Web Sleuth's post in which a user linked to the article about Kurtzman's arrest back in 2020 and simply wondered if there was a connection. That's kind of it. There's nothing in any news articles or official quotes from law enforcement that directly connects Kurtzman to the disappearance. And while there's a lot of possibility there left to explore, it appears that much like after Durst went to prison and people stopped bringing up his name, Kurtzman's death pretty much ended any conversation about him either. Another weird coincidental twist in a case that already has too many. This December will mark 30 years since John and Shelly Markley mysteriously vanished from their Bristolville, West Farmington home. Left behind was a house in disorder, a confusing set of clues that didn't directly lead anywhere, a family devastated by yet another loss, and 5 children who all these years later still desperately seek the truth about their beloved parents. John and Shelly have never been found, and although a tombstone has been erected for them, the family are acutely aware that their bodies are not buried beneath it. The family seeks answers. They want the truth, but more than anything else, they want to bring John and Shelly home, to lay them to rest, and to finally have the closure they need to properly mourn and move on with their lives. Unfortunately, after all of these years, unless someone comes forward, new evidence is found, or their bodies are located, the disappearance of John and Shelly Markley will remain open, unsolved, and growing cold. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of John and Shelly Markley, there are many websites and forums discussing this case. The Trail Went Cold has done an episode on it as well. For this episode, the Sentinel Tribune and Tribune Chronicle were the most helpful. However, this episode would not have been possible without the amazing and detailed reporting from the Plain Dealer. If you have any information about the disappearance of John and Shelly Markley, please contact the Trumbull County Sheriff's Office at 330-675-2508. They are case number 24-00448. You can also contact Crime Stoppers at 330-746-2583, where you can remain completely anonymous. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at traceevpod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. You can find all social media and contact links in the show notes. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank our amazing Patreon producers, without whom this show would not be possible. Ann M. Bertram, Brett Eady, Christine Greco, Crystal J., Dierthy, Denise Dingsdale, Deani Dyson, Jennifer Winkler, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, Leslie B., Lisa Hobson, Nick Mohar Schurz, Roberta Jansen, Stacy Finnegan, Tom Radford, and Whitney Welp. This concludes our look into the 1995 disappearance of John and Shelly Markley, an extremely solvable case if only those with additional information would come forward and tell what they know. There are 5 people out there today who grew up without the love and adoration of their parents, who were stolen away from them. And anyone who would conceal the truth is no better than the person who is responsible. I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me next time for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.